Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Leon Watkins. I'm a University Archivist at Kent State, and I have the wonderful pleasure of introducing Dr. Marissa Parham. Marissa Parham is Professor of English at Amherst College and directs the Immersive Reality Lab for the Humanities, which is a work group for digital and experimental humanities. She also serves as a Faculty Diversity and Inclusion Officer. Her current teaching and research projects focus on texts and technologies that problematize assumptions about time, space, and bodily materiality. She is particularly interested in how such terms share a history of increasing complexity in texts produced by African Americans, and how they also offer ways of thinking about intersectional approaches to digital humanities and technology studies. Marissa Parham holds a PhD in English and Comparative Literature from Columbia University and is the author of Haunting and Displacement in African American Literature and Culture, The African American Student's Guide to College, and is the co-editor of Theorizing Glissant, Cites and Citations. She currently serves on the board of directors for the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities and formerly served on the founding board of directors for the Amherst Cinema Arts Center. She is also a former director of the College Digital Humanities Initiative, serving Amherst, Hampshire, Mount Holyoke and Smith Colleges, and the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. So if you could please welcome me in welcoming Marissa Parham to the podium. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. So I was sitting there. Can you hear me okay? And you all can hear me okay? And I realized this is that hilarious moment of me being over here and the computer being over there. So we're gonna have some hilarious walking around moments. I promise you I'm not like lost and wandering, but that's kind of what it's gonna look like. And I'm sure this is that problem too where for me, so much of the point of being here is to sort of be here with you guys. But of course, it's also being recorded, so I apologize in advance. I'm doing everything wrong in terms of being recorded, beginning with turning my back. While I get this back up, I put it down because it seemed like I didn't want you all sitting here having to stare at it, but now I see that was the wrong choice, and it has to load for a second. So there'll be some stuff up on the screen. It's a little bit bright in here, but hopefully you guys will be able to see it. And it's not a huge deal. I just tend to put quotes up just to be helpful because it's hard when people are reading and like, what are they saying and what's the quote, you know? So it's literally just stuff like that. So it's more for reference. So it shouldn't be a stressful thing at all. Okay. It shouldn't be a stressful thing at all if you can't see it, because again, it's just there for reference and hopefully. Yes, my clicker loves me. So I think we'll be okay at the long distance. So the talk I'm giving today, the conversation I want to have, and that's how I think of as talks. I was looking at the program for this event, and I was thinking about, because so many of you are sort of activist, researcher, programmer, designer, archivist types, many of you in the work you're doing is very like, you get in there and you get it done. Yes, I just summarized your whole life work as you get in there and you get it done. But I think that's actually incredibly important. And what I wanted to offer today are simply a series of considerations that help pull out some of the other stuff underlying the stuff we're talking about, because it's actually really difficult. And I'm someone who works on sort of like the programming and code side of things, but also the literary history side of things. And I'm always aware of how much and how difficult it is to get those conversations going at the same time. And so I'm gonna lean a little bit more to the sort of concept, evocation, invocation side, simply because I want you guys to have a way to, again, just more languages, right? To pull out what you already have. And I was thinking, the subtitle of this talk, I call it Sample Signals Strobe. I feel like the subtitle is the internet giveth and the internet taketh away. An example of this, that's the whole talk. Actually, we can go home now. It's really true though. And I'm really kind of obsessed with this. how on the one hand, particularly social media, can be such a distressing space in which to experience our lives. But at the same time, it gives so many people life. And really thinking about that and just taking that really actually seriously. I do think sometimes when thinking about social media, we are a little bit on the academic side at a deficit because we do have to push against the ways in which historically it's taken academia a long time to catch up with understanding why the internet's important, frankly. And if you couple that, in our case, with thinking about why Black life is important, whoa, right? We have a lot of ground to cover. And so I was thinking about, and this is sort of a little bit out of order because what I've done is take different pieces of other talks that I've given to groups of people who do programming, people who do archival work, people, and I've sort of wanted to remix it for this group that actually covers all of the above. But I was thinking about this quote I saw online the other day. This is Alexis Madrigal, who writes for Fusion, writes for Atlantic Monthly, writes on tech in general. And he had this really interesting sort of piece. It was very short, and I thought it was interesting. And he was talking about how there's a way in which when we think about how we define ourselves in today's world, so much of this can also go to defining yourself in relation to a technology, right? So, you know, I still think of like, you know, Erykah Badu's like analog girl in a digital world. For me, I think of like the ways in which I've embraced so much of digital technology, but part of me is still very cassette oriented. Even in my talk today, I'm talking about sampling, I'm talking about remixes, I'm talking about mixtapes, and the way I've constructed this talk is sort of as a theoretical mixtape. It's an actual thing for me. It's not like a nicety. It's actually how I think. And he has this other point in this, and also thinking about how these technologies are changing so quickly now that, of course, we have to think of them as like sort of slices of time. So you can't, you know, I can say I'm a cassette girl and be talking about like 25 years of my life, whereas now you can say I'm an MP3 girl and you're talking about a couple of years, maybe a couple of months. Like, so what does that mean? But we're going to put that aside. I was just really interested in this notion. He's talking about the pleasure. This is the second paragraph. That's my shit. You know, yeah, cassettes. You're like, word up, right? And like, that's your thing. But then he had this other point that I thought was really beautiful and that I do want to dwell on today. This is towards the bottom. And yet you share something real with the other people who understand, like really understand one of these moments. And no one else can join the club. It can't be looked up on Wikipedia or gathered from Google or glimpsed in a YouTube video. You can't buy that experience on Etsy or eBay or even the weirdest vintage place in all of Oakland. You had to be a body in a place in a culture. You had to be there. And so in thinking about the digital and thinking about the archival and thinking about events and uprisings, thinking about the place of the body, some bodies that are present on the ground, I think being here today, for which I'm just so grateful to be here today in Ferguson, and thinking about it as a specific place with a specific history, with specific bodies on the ground that have specific terror enacted against them, that also have specific pleasures, specific ways of doing things, favorite sandwiches, favorite beverages, and so on and so forth. There's an experience, is what I'm getting at, of living in the world, right? That's attached to place. That the digital, in the same time, amplifies this out. Right? So on the one hand, you're thinking of living in the world, but also thinking about the ways in which your experience of the world also crosses all these other ideas of other worlds as well. So I'm going to try and move quickly today through a lot of material. And so part of that, for me, means a lot of reading. And I'm just reading to move quickly, so there's some time, hopefully, to talk or can talk later. I was also thinking about another Alexis Madrigal piece that goes alongside this, and this was a longer piece that came in, I think, last week, by the way, in Atlantic Monthly. It's really interesting for this group, by the way. And it's talking about how, in the future, historians are going to struggle to be able to write histories of the internet because so many of the technologies that drive the internet, you know, the actual softwares, like Facebook, for instance, are black boxes. And so there's a way in which the idea of archiving and producing historical knowledge about our today as a past has already been problematized by proprietary knowledges. And that's underlying this as well, this talk I'm giving today. And so if you think about that, right, and then you also think about the ways in which our bodies are themselves also archives of technologies, right? So I'm interested in the ways in which the technological writ large, to quote internet, software, Twitter, Facebook, social media platforms are themselves black boxes, but also how we're kind of black boxes too, and thinking about the place of our experiences in all of this. That was very vague, but hopefully I'll make it more clear. Underlying this is a conference we had at Amherst College a few weeks ago called Digital Africas, which brought together people working on the African continent on digital stuff. And one of the participants, Kaguru, made this amazing point talking about, just sort of in passing, about how anytime you have a group of people together, particularly if you're thinking about people from marginalized communities, anytime you gather those people to talk about their experiences, you're creating an archive. You're also simultaneously experiencing an archive, which always makes me think of, I wrote this recently, of James Baldwin in Sonny's Blues. He has this beautiful scene of children sitting at twilight and are listening to their elders tell all these terrible stories about the day. But of course, the elders are kind of talking in code, right? They're not like being explicit, like, oh, you know how that woman at work is, right? And how the kids are just laying there and absorbing it. And how that act of absorption is their experience of archival knowledge that even they themselves as children can't fully access until much later in their lives. They won't understand it till it happens to them. But when it happens to them, they have been already given the tools to process this thing. Even at the time of acquisition, it was obscure to them, right? So again, that's the kind of stuff I want to think about. Taking together, I argue, this offers us also a way of thinking about the importance of knowing how to talk about our experiences, both quantitatively and qualitatively. A lot of the work of Doc Now is doing right now is helping us develop rigorous practices around collecting and archiving, and also at gatherings like this with community members, activists, scholars, thinking about the ways in which every part of the process has to be brought together in order to be a check on another part of the process. We produce our own checks and balances, and thinking about the sort of intellectual and emotional rigor that comes with that, but also the kind of affective work that includes, to make sure that work is done right and that it's done in ways that both honor and expand the moments that call us into action. Though by no means marking new fields of inquiry, developing multiple pathways and understanding how technological formations mediate communication within and across Black communities carries renewed urgency, both as we look for ways to historicize and conceptualize phenomena like Black Twitter, and also, of course, with the rise of social media activism, for instance, the Black Lives Matter movement. Such work is particularly interesting when set alongside dominant narratives characterizing the digital divide, especially in terms of African Americans. For while it is critically important to assure that African Americans have seats at the financial, intellectual, creative, and technical tables that constitute the tech industry, it is also concerning that there are so many narratives around Black technological deficit, but seldom acknowledgement of the wave of Black technological accomplishment. This is especially striking in light of how quickly Black communities have been shown to adopt and adapt the affordances of new technologies. Indeed, in regards to thinking about social media technologies, Black youth are so much at the cutting edge that you sometimes wonder if they're ahead of the technologies themselves, gifting the world with a present that many people otherwise only imagine as the future. What would it mean to take this perception seriously? What kinds of critical structures might be distilled from thinking about technological adoption as itself a kind of Black cultural practice? What might it mean to articulate the digital as endemic to African American experience, even if so doing means resetting the timeline for when we imagine the technical emergence of digital technologies? The method of the talk I'll be giving today is one of speculative frameworking, the purpose of which is to distill a critical approach that takes seriously the belief that our scholarship is especially right place for modeling livable futures for people on the ground, for people invested in using hardware and software to recover, center, or thematize the lives of marginalized communities. Social media is important to this inquiry because it's been so heavily used by African Americans for most of its short lifespan. It's also important because social media experience can be productively understood as technically parallel to complex matters of cultural ownership, transmission, and participation in African American culture. So to be clear, what I'm saying is that it's not important to think about the digital in terms of Black life because it makes Black life much more interesting to think about, like, ooh, the digital, because we just a little category called ooh, the digital, in the world in general. But that there's something endemic or inherent to diasporic experience itself that reproduces some of the technical structure of what we otherwise call the digital. So just to be clear, I want us thinking in both directions. For the way I'm using it, and I move quite quickly between them, but I'm using the digital as a metaphor, but also not a metaphor at all, as descriptive. My talk today is thinking about the various kinds of social, cultural, and emotional labor accomplished by people's use of Twitter hashtags. This inquiry was motivated by the prominent role Twitter played in public discourse in the wake of numerous brutality cases against African Americans in the United States, perhaps most prominently beginning with the murder of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin in Florida in 2012, and really solidifying its place in the spotlight in 2014 in Ferguson. In working with software, for instance, the Doc Now stuff that lets you work with the Twitter API, my research team became interested in how we might characterize what emerged for us as a difference between Twitter as a data set and Twitter as an experience. There's a tension between notational, metric, countable aspects of Twitter, the data we associate with individual utterances, and the sweeping, constant, human-generated meaningfulness for which those utterances, or to which those utterances were to contribute. Right? On the one hand, Twitter is absolutely nothing but software. It's the most software of software, right? But the feelings of it, right, that it elicits and how that works with software and also remakes the software is what's interesting to me. I'm interested then in sort of the interactions between data per se and the often mysterious waves of voice, performance, and gesture in social media, and how this puts particular and significant pressure on working with the social media archive. Despite the immense amounts of metadata attached to a tweet, the significance of much of a tweet's data is lost once the circumstance of a tweet's appearance passes away. As well as Tanisha Taylor, Burgess Jules, and others have noted in their work with developing social media archives in the wake of Ferguson, the presentist orientation of tweeting, the thing you say now in order to get the thing said, the thing done in the moment, problematizes the very idea of archival work. For instance, when tweeters want to delete their tweets after an event has passed. What does it mean for us to want to keep them? My team was especially interested in a series of emotionally captivating data visualizations that have been circulating in popular media in the wake of the 2014 protests against racial violence here in Ferguson. Created by S. Rogers and distributed in the online edition of the Daily Mail, a London newspaper, this interactive heat map allowed viewers to watch Twitter users wait for and respond to the Ferguson grand jury's November 2014 decision on whether or not to indict Darren Wilson. So, and I've talked about this before, but I think it's worth showing it again. I'll scooch around and have to come back. Let me find my map. You just had a whole preview of the whole thing for a map that's not here at all. This is the part where I have to go back to the computer, I guess, and turn my back, but it's worth it. Trust me, it's worth it. So in thinking about this, there's also someone else's computer, so this is going to be hilarious. But in thinking about this and sort of thinking about the ways in which, watch this, we're going to use the internet. We're just going to go right around this problem. I feel like there's rules about things you do in presentations, and this is everything you don't do. But this is the map I want you looking at. And this way also it'll get us a place where we can play a little bit with it as well. What was interesting about this to me, it will go, is thinking about how, on the one hand, you have an experience, if you're here in Ferguson, of being here, in all the intense feelings someone like me imagines that elicits, whether you're participating on the streets or not. The imagination, of course, and I think it's reasonable, is that you're in a world of feeling. Everything is feeling. And we know that how this works. So this is also that moment where things are so intense, you're walking along, you stub your toe, and you're like, I'll kill you toe, right? It's too much, and everything is that feeling of too much. And so alongside that then, there's also this sense of other people participating at the same time. And so what this map does that's so interesting, and this is what I want to look at for a moment, is that it looks at or asks us to sort of think about what other people who are not on the moment or not in the moment are also doing. It's like we're blocking your flash, that's fine. So what you see in this map, therefore, is sort of the ways in which every time someone tweets, you get a flare. And I'm really interested in the movement of those flares and thinking about what's at stake and thinking about the distance between this feeling of the whole world watching and this notion that if you're present in the space, you're not watching, you're participating. So also, what is the difference, therefore, between watching and presentation? It seems very basic, like, duh, they're different. But I think there's something there that we have to think a little bit differently now that we're working in the world of social media, where it's not just even sitting and watching TV, it's participating, it's tweeting, it's retweeting, it's looking up information, it's calling your friends. It's a sort of whole body experience that I think is something a little bit different. And that's what I'm getting at. By visualizing social media data, hashtags, geolocation, and timestamps, the map was able to concretize the sense that the whole world was indeed watching. In this use, heat mapping is a tool for visualizing a single data point, a hashtag, and displaying it across several dimensions simultaneously: time, location, and frequency. Each instance of tweeting is marked on the map. A point of light indicates its location. The lively or animated quality of the map is accomplished by including time as an axis of experience. Marking different tweets incrementally across a span of time makes it seem as if the light points are seething and throbbing, as users' different moments of interaction become aesthetically connected, producing a sense of temporal continuity. Just as the map's flickering lights amplify users' simple acts of tweeting as phenomena of appearance, so you tweet and you appear on the map. The increasing numbers of users across the map and the increase in tweeting activity produce an effect wherein to participate is to give off a spark. Indeed, in the daily news map, the animation increases as people are waiting for the news. The first one is captioned buzzing, and then as you see more and more of these nodes of light appear, it says internet on fire. By foregrounding some of the Twitter metadata that otherwise would go unnoticed by an average participant, the Daily Mail visualization uses what you do not see in order to visualize what you might feel in such a moment of high observational participation. Despite being generated out of data, the value of its effect is mainly in the metaphorical resonance, in how it produces a sense of affective dimensionality by transforming basic data coordinates, again, hashtag time and location, into a representation of the world's the flaring of the world's participation in a political moment. But even as it represents the world on fire, the origin of the participation mapped in the Daily Mail visualization is the factual ubiquity of Black death. For many people, every day, the world is indeed on fire. In this way, the subordination of content in the map's aesthetic effect can also be read as an apt representation of the serial nature of Michael Brown's death, as the event of his death, of course, carried the specific importance of his human life, but also communicated his status as one of many Black children killed by police in the United States. If Rogers' map uses what one does not see in order to visualize what one might feel in such a moment of high participation, understanding Brown's death as one of many also transmits an affective meaningfulness in excess of particular content, what Catherine McKittrick has referred to as the list, the breathless numbers, the absolutely economic, the mathematics of the unliving. Qualitatively encoded in understanding the impact of Brown's death is the reiteration of a quantitative reality. Brown dies, and I think, again. The mathematics of the unliving is an historical metadata that produces a sense of resonance beyond a discrete moment, producing a memory that circulates without origin. In moments of such experience, content and ownership are subordinated to haunting resonance and uncanny circulation. At some point, you don't care always where the tweets are coming from. The act of retweeting, right, doesn't interesting thing to authorship. What gives it meaning is the repetition itself, right? Accounting for how Black life requires a capacity to constantly index Black death and the interspatial cross-temporal processes this instantiates helps us to conceptualize the digital dimensionality of Black diasporic life. So now I want to pivot a bit and think about this as a kind of sampling, and haunting and sampling in the digital. Writing instability between to, from, or for is a way of characterizing the haunted nature of Black life, as a way of articulating what it means to experience other people's memories with the affective impact of personal first-hand experience. This is a way of thinking about that moment of hearing of a death of a Black man and saying, again. I call this haunting, which is a term I use to describe how memories might circulate without proper origin. For instance, how one person might remember another person's experience as if it were her own. In the name of movement and transmittability, the digital sacrifices any easy sense of origin, again, to sort of retweets, the remix. But set free to circulate, at every instance of its emergence, the digital potentially, or the digital signal potentially reproduces something often just as important as origin. Other people's memory combined with one's own, the sample. It is the pleasure and pain of the signal. It is the again. If I'm alone and I hear this news and I say again, and I suffer, when I'm in community and I hear this news and I say again, the chorus rises up and says, yes, again, right? So thinking about what happens in those moments, the signal, the sample, the remix. From this perspective, movement, once signifying loss itself, also becomes the site of recuperation, even if it comes without restoration. And then sort of think of these tweets moving around and moving around. Indeed, much as early DJs used 2 analog turntables to disaggregate songs so that it might be used as if they were digital, because that's essentially what you're doing. You're taking analog, right, and you're making it behave as if it were digital. This is one of the ways I make the argument of thinking about Black popular culture as sort of digital before digital caught up, right? We were making digital things before we had digital technologies. But yes, so DJs used 2 turntables as if they were digital so they could make new things, and these new things could be made to resonate with continually receding past, the sample. Black life harkens to the digital because Black diasporic existence is a digitizing experience. Transfer, migration, metonymy, the break, the remix, in tracing the multiple and continual experiences of forced migration and violence endemic to Afro-diasporic life in the Americas, the Middle Passage, the auction block, the Great Migration, segregation, we begin to see how the digitality, as a generative lens through which to understand African American cultural production. Much as we often use the word ghost as a catch-all for that which is generated in the breaks between the evidential and ephemeral, thinking about haunting as a kind of digital experience helps us to get the circulation of memory, pain, and affect on social media platforms. From this perspective, digitality can be understood as describing mechanisms by which other people's experiences emerge and reemerge across separated, discrete times and spaces. It is also a way of characterizing the haunted nature of Black life, thinking again about what it means to witness other people's lives with the affective dimensionality of first-person experience. On the one hand, I can critique the map I had up of people around the world who aren't there simply responding. But what I like about that map and its flaring is it does transmit the sense of how deep that response nonetheless is. Again, how do we take seriously this difference between presence and witnessing, while at the same time being sure to understand that this is also a new kind of witnessing that's far closer to presence than what we've had before. I know that's vague, but this is what I'm just trying to get at, and sort of like putting a lot of words around as a way of thinking about it. One way I'm thinking about this in terms of haunting is thinking about the problem of things that we imagine as emerging through us or against us, things that can happen with us or without us. Are these feelings coming from the inside or coming from the outside? Do I feel this way because of a thing I saw, or do I feel this way because of something about me? A social media feed is almost always displaced from the time and space of a given user's embodied present. A timeline is a software expression of a person's clicking, reading, pausing, returning, liking, and sharing. We talk about the digital as if it were disembodied, but it has, or it needs, our eyes, our ears, our hands, our postures, our gestures, our breath. Social media and the digital, the interface is nothing without our bodies. We talk about digital experiences ethereal, but they are fundamentally earthly. Much of this results from social media technology's special effects. So again, thinking of the heat map and the way the lights burn and flicker in and out. Because they move backward through time, literally taking down the screen, the visual timelines through which most social media platforms are experienced gives the illusion that the life of an utterance passes away as it moves away. But even as we take seriously the passing away into old news, the taking away of tweets down the timeline, it might be worthwhile to account for social media accretion, for the life and ongoing effect of the social media past. What are some strategies for thinking about these pasts? Or, more precisely, how do we reconcile a sense of the contemporary social media timeline as ephemeral and keyed to a data present, while also attending to how our bodies hold, resonate with, and respond to accretion, the accumulation of the past? I'm thinking of myself and so many others who, at very set intervals at this point, have to take social media breaks, right? So I'm thinking about the walk away. So literally thinking about what's accreting in the body, right? We have a technological narrative that's about the ticking of the timeline and the ephemeral and the way things pass, right? You miss stuff. It's in the past. It has to be dug back out. It's the archival. But the body doesn't experience it that way at all. The body experiences even things that recede into the past as nonetheless reemergence and repetition. So we're resolving, again, this dialectic. For if we accept that social media participation is also an embodied relationship, then it follows that the data present might not necessarily square with the body's drive to remember. Indeed, while we understand how the depths of individuals are entered into this vast circulation of feeling, and understand Black Death as a mathematics, as McKittrick puts it, how do we also cope with the specificity of our own bodily experiences? And as well, if you recall where I began this talk with the Alexis Madrigal, this is a way of thinking about the black box problem. Not only does the black box describe a challenge for interpreting the technical workings of the internet in a historical framework, an archival framework, but it also describes the difficulties we have with processing and describing and living with the onslaught of information, which in my own work, again, I talk about as haunting, and which Christina Sharp has more recently characterized as living in the wake. In On Seeing Through Twitter, Jeffrey Morrow notes that even as a rhetorical framing of the digital and digital experience rightfully focuses on disembodiment and accelerationism, it is important to register other kinds of digital experience. One might argue that for contemporary African Americans, quote, social media over-concretizes lives in ways that bodies can't sustain, end quote. Morrow goes on to discuss the writer Webb Smith's description of dealing with the constant specter of Black Death on Twitter. It's worth repeating here. That's a nice, I want to say repeating, keep saying retweeting. Twitter, quote, Twitter is suffering because it is the most accurate reflection of American society today. It's not just what's tweeted, it's what isn't tweeted. Each day, a new hashtag represents a dead child. Often there's a film murder attached. Often still, we must watch it. Again, social media is on the one hand absolutely concrete. When you post a tweet, you're doing a material thing, a material process, and a material trace. But that doing is immediately also key to a time, a moment which will soon pass. At the same time, the experience of the moment of composing or reading or sharing does not in fact pass. It remains. Each day, a new hashtag. On the one hand, Smith's observation comports with the sense of the timeline that marches on through time. At the same time, each day, a new hashtag represents a dead child, also keens and mourns, as time's march forward is experienced as repetition, as entrapment in historical past of racial violence that refuses to pass. In instilling in us a certain sense of time, and in localizing that specific experience of time to specific platforms with distinctive interfaces, social media consolidates its status as a site wherein we materially experience the localization of social and affect forces. Social media, in other words, is also a place. So I'm interested in this and thinking about signals and thinking about how we send these messages. And I want to use a more, not positive narrative, but narrative of thinking about, again, I've sort of dipped, because I have to, into thinking about the pain, but thinking about how the possibility of that pain brings a possibility of its own recuperation because it's a way of communicating. In the longer version of this, I think a lot about how so many Black communities in the Americas had to develop ways to communicate under duress. And so another way of thinking about digital compression is thinking about encoding and thinking about the ways in which signals are sent in ways that it's important that make it possible to communicate out in the open, so that the people you're communicating in front of don't know what you're saying, right? I don't know why I just had a vision of it. And so I talk, for instance, about how so much of this becomes gestural. It's the wink, it's the smirk, it's a, right? Isn't it many of the day, someone said something and someone went, I heard it was so great because I couldn't see the other person. This person, unnamed person, said a thing that may or may not, I think, okay, it was crazy. You're like, what are you even talking about? People, what, right? And I hear just in the back, I hear this, and that was everything. Because I was like, phew, I'm not the crazy one. He's crazy, you know? So it was like this small witness way off in the corner somewhere. But all I needed was that tiniest little sound. And for most of the people in the room, they didn't even hear anything. They probably just thought someone like had like hiccuped or was like, but it wasn't, it was, right? And that difference is everything. And so I'm really interested in how those little gestural moments compress all this meaning and how we use that to send signals to each other under duress. And that's an example. We weren't under duress, but that's an example of how this stuff, let me be clear, let me not overextend like my department meeting. But it's a way, like, ooh, bring it down a notch. But it's simply a way of thinking about how communities have produced cultural formations out of the circumstances of duress, and they carry still some of those properties, right? The secretiveness, right? I can imagine someone like, why did you just go, what does that even mean? And the person's like, right? You don't even respond. You respond to like the inquiry about with the right? You would never say it. And the you would never say it is the interesting part. So anyway, thinking about this, and so thinking about how these sort of individual expressions also support repetitions of some other kinds of knowing. You can only understand a signal as such if you know what it looks like, what it sounds like. I'm also interested in how signals often pick up the kind of constant and intense wordplay at the heart of African American signifying traditions, traditions that carry structural similarities to the folksonomic quality of user-generated social media metadata, what we call hashtags. Folksonomy, I should have put it up, so it's like folksonomy, is a term Twitter developer Chris Messina used to describe the functionality of social media hashtags, a neologism especially useful to discussion when put alongside Barbara Christian's foundational description of Black theorizing. And I'm realizing I left my clicker over here. That's why I'm not showing you any of these things. But one thing that's really useful, I think, in the Christian, I'll skip ahead a little bit, which I'll read, I just think it's really useful. So I'm thinking about this idea of hashtags and thinking about what Christian describes as the ways in which Black people so much enjoy the theoretical and the conceptual, and how I think this is really important for thinking about the idea of signal making. And she's really into, she says, particularly for Black women, this notion of pithy language that unmasks the power relationships of their world, right? The way you say that one thing. And it's not just that you're saying, so this is up here. So it's not just that you're saying that one thing, but also that in saying that one thing, it actually unmasks an entire structure, blooms around it, right? For people of color, I've always theorized about how these forms are so different. I won't read the whole thing. And then I like this towards the bottom. And women, at least the women I grew up around, continuously speculated about the nature of life through pithy language that unmasked the power relationships of their world. My folk, in other words, have always been a race for theory, though more in the form of the hieroglyph, a written figure which is both sensual and abstract, both beautiful and communicative. So thinking about the hashtag as that hieroglyph, right? And the ways hashtags immediately pull together information, pull together meaning, and allow that sort of quick movement of witnessing and the digital repetition and signal sending over and over again. I'm also thinking alongside this about Justice Johnson's claim about, and this almost gets to Kaguro's sense of every time you have a gathering, you have an archive, right? Christian's articulation can be set productively alongside Jessica Marie Johnson's description of what it means to work in archival spaces from a simultaneously Black and digital perspective, in which she emphasizes how the digital influences her, quote, understanding of how to read sources and how people in the past and present are engaged with each other, and how to read into things that are more ephemeral, like moments in which we laugh, in which language changes, and the shorthand languages that we use among each other that define who is kin, friend, or enemy. Those moments or spaces that are more ephemeral are both analogous of social media spaces and also the ways and moments that diasporic Black folk have played in the fragments of the archives. A hashtag's meaning is made in a moment of its use, even as communicative power comes out of the fact of other people's uses. As a kind of sampling, the temporality of that use is in the present of user innovation, even as the power of that innovation simultaneously depends on how that use harkens to a shared understanding of the past, expressed in riffs and improvisations like those associated with urban legend. As Patricia Turner reminds us, textual circulation in Black communities has historically been as much about the why, how, and when of dissemination as it is about the text isolatable message or denotation. So I feel like in the right moment, if something's going on in the news or something else, I could probably produce a hashtag called and my whole tweet could be the hashtag and people might know would retweet and like, what are we even talking about? And we're like, what are you even talking about? You just look and you go, right? So this is a way in which the form is as important as the content, right? And the fact of the repetition becomes the message. When thinking about heavily circulated texts, Turner tells us it's more useful to look to, quote, what in the text themselves or in the circumstance of their dissemination gave them life and made African Americans willing to incorporate them into their repertoires, rather than imagine that text carries significant meaning beyond the need to transmit it. Turner's work helps us see how the very fact of the repetition itself communicates. Have you seen this? Have you heard about this? How much time do I have? How are we on time, Precious? I wanted to give another example. Can I give you all an example of this? I think a good example of this, I was thinking about this recently and thinking about the form and structure of this and thinking about the Kanye West moment. I had an experience, you're like, which one, right? Well, this is hilarious because this is, I was like thinking, but I was also trying to like read you all, but not read you all as an audience. You had an experience of teaching last semester where I mentioned the Kanye the first moment around Hurricane Katrina. But it was the same moment because I had started talking, and this is where I showed my age. I was going on about the Kanye West moment. The host, this class of like 50 students, and they're like, "Why is she talking?" And they were all like comparing, like she's talking, and they had like a long list of what I was possibly talking about, you know. And although we had been talking about Hurricane Katrina, so I felt like I had made the connection, but I kind of hadn't because one, there were so many, but two, also simply because that one had sort of faded for them. Right? So that was more the point, right? But I'm using my Black privilege, I'm blushing. I'm still thinking about this moment. But I think it's a really good example because it's a sense of the ways in which this notion of this sort of Black fidelity and facility with language to produce sort of forms that are amenable to digital transmission for me, in many ways, that moment of Hurricane Katrina, the telethon, George Bush doesn't care about Black people, is a first sort of hashtag or sort of meme moment, right? And so really thinking about what it did. And in the longer piece, I talk about the ways it became sampled in songs and in emails, and right? So all these transmissions. And the timing of it was also really interesting too. In the way it came after the Janet Jackson 2004 Super Bowl malfunction, which we know is why we have YouTube. It's literally the reason we're given for why YouTube was created, so that people could watch the malfunction, right? Which is 2004. And then you have the Relief Telethon in 2005, and then the Gina 6 case in 2006, which I also read as that sort of transition from Black radio to Black social media was in that moment. So thinking about that. So that's the configuration, just to give you a little bit of background that I'm thinking about. But I was thinking, again, also about, again, to go back to signals for a second. From the outside, a signal appears to be disconnected from the terms of a common reality, literally emerging out of anywhere and out of nowhere. Why are you making that sound? Why are you sucking your teeth? What's even happening? The glances and winks, without proper transmission or without proper receipt, are reduced to facial tics, weird sounds. The crystallizing statement becomes non sequitur, ungrammatical. I think this is really interesting for thinking about the West, because there's a way in which the suddenness of George Bush doesn't care about Black people really marks this, and it's really in here. Looking back at the footage, I'm struck by how terrified West looks. Hands in pockets, trying not to sway, he seems trapped between impatience and dread. I imagine West is unnerved by his own reading about Black suffering from a teleprompter at a mainly white event, and trying to think about the space of his own intervention. Suddenly, as if coming to his own awareness of the situation, West goes off script. I'm going to reread it just to bring it back for you guys. And the videos are all kind of jankety, and it takes a little while for them to get going, so I'm just going to read it. He begins by responding to the force of the irony of his own situation, his own complicity as someone who identifies with the victims, but who is also simultaneously merely an onlooker. West then proceeds to string across other such ironies, producing an associative sequence. The sequence is long, but worth repeating. I hate the way they portray us in the media. You see a Black family, it says they're looting. You see a white family, it says they're looking for food. And you know, it's been 5 days because most of the people are Black. And even for me to complain about it, I would be a hypocrite because I've tried to turn away from the TV because it's too hard to watch. I've been shopping before even giving a donation. So now I'm calling my business manager right now to see what is the biggest amount I can give. And just to imagine if I was down there, and those are my people down there. In his statement, West calls out the criminalization of Black people in media representation, and immediately ties that representation to the slowness of federal response to Katrina. He then turns to himself, explicitly connecting his sense of complicity to his status as an onlooker, a consumer of media. He then shifts from complicity with the onlookers to identification with the victims. Those are my people down there, he says. West ends with a call to action, even as he himself continues to slip uncomfortably between populations, speaking both for the watcher and for the watched, trying in real time to move from onlooker to witness. He continues. So anybody out there who wants to do anything that we can help, with the way America is set up to help the poor, the Black people, the less well-off, as slow as possible. I mean, the Red Cross is doing everything they can. We already realize a lot of people that could help are at war right now, fighting another way, and they've given them permission to go down and shoot us. The ways in which that last line comes from nowhere and hangs on the end. It's really, I remember going back to this because, you know, it became sort of a cultural cliche to talk about Kanye West and the Hurricane Katrina moment. I remember going back to this and being actually really shocked. And I'm reading it because when you're hearing it, maybe I should have played it. It kind of just slides in because he's doing it in this kind of quick monologue. But when you slow down and really hear it, right? He goes, you know, what can we do to help? You know, the way you treat people. You know, like pause. You know, Black people, and it's like I'm not reading it weird. It's just no connectors. The Black people, the less well off, as slow as possible. But again, you know what he means. And this is what he knows. And this is where to be very careful because in the sort of, I think, post-cultural renditions of this, I think the response was positive in a moment, but then later becomes a sort of joke of him just rambling. It's not rambling at all. It's just it's like bullet points, right? But you have to have the sort of connective tissue or understand how to produce the connective tissue between the points, right? Is what I'm getting at. We already realize, I'm just repeating, we already realize a lot of people that could help are at war right now. So he's also hearing the critique as he's saying it. Red Cross is so slow, blah, blah, blah. So he's responding, and this is where I'm saying it becomes really interesting. He's trying to occupy all positions at once. This is the complexity of his own privilege as a black celebrity, right? Trying to be, and is, I would argue, in all the places. I shouldn't say trying to be. He's struggling with the fact that he is occupying all the positions at once. He's also a black man. He's also a celebrity. He's also in privilege. He's also suffering. He also understands. He also should be helping. He also, right? We already realize a lot of people that could help right now, who could help are at war right now, fighting another way. Pause. And they've given them permission to go down and shoot us. And to me, I'm like, for me, George Bush doesn't care about black people. And pause, this is like commentary, right? There's a way in which George Bush doesn't care about black people, which is the next line. Ooh, we're all like, ooh, whatever, he's talking to the president. To me, that's the line I can't believe got said and that no one talked about. And they've given them permission to go down and shoot us. It's important to note that this form of association, oh, then Mike Myers says something. He's like, we're very sad. This is so hard, etc. And that's when Kanye West says, George Bush doesn't care about black people. And it ends, right? And he cut the Chris Tucker. So I want to cut Chris Tucker's like, it's important to note that this form of associative signifying on social political ills is common to African-American expressive traditions, particularly in popular protest music that structurally resonates with the field holler, a form of call and response used first on plantations and work farms that coded shared experiences of suffering into music and into short terms that seem like non sequiturs to non-insiders. What is so often characterized as West's disconnected, off-the-cuff rant is formally no different than Stevie Wonder's Pastime Paradise or Marvin Gaye's Make Me Wanna Holler, right? They use that same staccato sort of delivery of bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, right? Or the staccato trace of recondite 5%er one-liners dropped across early 21st century rap and R&B music, right? There was that moment, particularly I was thinking like sort of in Nas, and like AZ, where you'll be listening to a song. This is sort of in the 90s, early 2000s, this sort of big sort of post-Wu-Tang 5%er moment. And you would hear, you know, they would say like, thing, 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 period, and raping our women. And you're like, that wasn't relevant to that point about this, but yet it was, because there's a way of talking about a structure of oppression and sexual violence, right? But again, from the outside, it just seems like random. Like, why is this mill thing about like losing a game of cards? You say this. Right? It's because it signifies, it compresses a structure of meaning within. And indeed, in the second half of his statement, the structure of West's observations read like a bulleted distillation of how moments like Hurricane Katrina's aftermath are talked about in black communities, a kind of intra-community encoding that culminates as such in the explosive intimacy of West's closing observation. Again, they've given them permission to go down and shoot us. They, them, us. By finally settling on a mode of address, having processed where he falls in the continuum between them and us, West is then able to compress his sprawling and historicized personal sense of the moment into a clear and transmittable form. His posture changes, he straightens up and focuses on the camera. George Bush doesn't care about black people. In a singular utterance, West steps away from the referencing and indexing and signifying and processing and compresses the sprawl of the struggle into a single sentence, a signal. Indeed, even though the hashtag would not be introduced into social media until its 2007 implementation in Twitter, in its compression and its suddenness and its capacity to become appropriate to a range of negative experiences, George Bush doesn't care about black people can be read as one of the early instances of a social media hashtag. With his utterance, West gave life to a communicative structure that could be used to signal a broad range of daily experiences that in their core both resonated with and could be used to remind others of the political stakes of West's declaration. I remember with my friends, it was like, did your car break down? It's like, why'd your car break down? Because George Bush does not care about black people, right? You just got your hair straightened and it's raining. Why? Because George Bush does not care about black people. No one thinks that the president controls the weather or that one's car broke down because of some targeted government action. But in capturing the sense of having been made negatively subject to forces beyond one's own immediate control, George Bush doesn't care about black people is revealed as appropriate to black suffering as any other utterance. It's completely transmittable, transportable, and useful. When West suddenly and unexpectedly blurred out, George Bush doesn't care about black people, I was not shocked at the declaration. I was shocked that it had been said in the middle of an obdurably white mainstream television event. I remember jumping up with something between a yelp, a yes, and a cry. I was able to see it live. Not what was said, but that it had been said. Because I could barely understand what he said, but I knew he had said something. Oh, he said it. People are like, what did he say? I'm like, but he said it. Because we have transcripts now. But in the moment, I would be a liar if I said I knew exactly what he had said. But I know he had said it. Not what had been said, but that it had been said. With the ensuing samples, memes, and the constant remixes, constituting what Dexter Thomas describes as, quote, a way to celebrate the fact that someone had finally managed to broadcast a collective sentiment felt by millions, Black Lives Matter. It's become de rigueur in some circles to mock West's outbursts, but in the moment it was right, and it was right on time. Like a rememory, the signal is always there, waiting for you, simultaneously an experience of encounter and also an emergence and repetition out of the self. As a medicum for the failure of any national entity to adequately or compassionately address the tragedy of Hurricane Katrina's aftermath, George Bush doesn't care about Black people, crystallized the understanding that all political establishments had again failed. Tears in my eyes, I stood there. Much as the form of West ad-lib matches the plain structure of rap and soul's music encounter with negative social realities, the repetition of materials broadcast across sonic spaces, like those created by Black radio, and then later across digital spaces using email, itself becomes a form of content. The West statement becomes a sample. First a signal, then a sample, called upon to hold, then bloom, then regather meaning when words otherwise fail. In this paradigm, the act of sharing says everything that becomes too painful to repeat, even in the wake of the repetition of the conditions of why things happen. And let me close with this. And from Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, Keeanga-Yamahtta Smith narrates the arrival of the Black Lives Matter hashtag. After learning that George Zimmerman would not be charged in the murder of Trayvon Martin, she says, quote, out of despair over the verdict, organizer Alicia Garza posted a simple hashtag on Facebook, Black Lives Matter. It was a powerful rejoinder that spoke directly to the dehumanization and criminalization that made Martin seem suspicious in the first place and allowed the police to make no effort to find out to whom this boy belonged. It was a response to the oppression, inequality, and discrimination that devalued Black life every day. It was everything, in 3 simple words. Black Lives Matter, the hashtag, is a recognition, a call to action, an ironic testimony. In this political context, social media performances motivate solidarity, not with a thing, but with an understanding. And again, you go back to the place of the body and thinking about this from an archival perspective, what does it mean to also try to elicit from archives the feeling of the understanding in the moment of the social media utterance? To use the language of the Ferguson Action website, we are connected online and in the streets. We are decentralized but coordinated. What does it mean to say you are connected online and in the streets? That you're decentralized but coordinated. This is the power of the digital. Indeed, Kelly Moore has rightfully pointed out the motivational and also discursive power of the Black Lives Matter hashtag. She ties it to the idea of ashe, the power of making in the world, the crossroads, the place where meaning is made at the intersection between difference and familiarity, where we carry diasporically from the Yoruba to the Puerto Rican, to the Cuban, to the Brazilian, to the United States, and to the Americas in general. Ashe, the crossroads, she says, and I quote, the concept takes the special language of prayer and invocation, and in the double movement enshrines it as an interface. Ashe is fundamental to Yoruba poetics and is performed in song, sculpture, textiles, patterns, and medicine. Phonemic awareness of the slant rhyme between hashtag and ashe, the sh, Black Matter and Black Mater, should draw our attention to the slippages and breaks between concepts. Slant rhyme, known as half, near, oblique, weak, lazy rhyme, is marked by its definitional deficiency in relation to perfect rhyme or true rhyme. One way to appreciate slant rhyme is as rhyme in black, as rhyme in the break. Attending to the pleasure of phonemic awareness is a commitment to the necessary compositional crime of Black rhyme. In the case of Black Lives Matter, ashe compositional protocols break, transfigure, and slant between street and digital interfaces. The Black Lives Matter hashtag is a bioelectric song whose ashe was powerful enough to socially organize and threaten enemies online while also gathering people in physical geographies. And thinking about Moore's point, this notion of the slant rhyme from hashtag to ashe, she offers us an interesting way of thinking about the circulation of energies through our own bodies at the moment of participation in a social media moment. In thinking about what's at stake in producing archives out of that moment, it is interesting, therefore, to imagine different ways to be able to visualize the feeling of participation, the kinds of narratives we need to create in relationship to archives that also transmit, be it creatively, electronically, sonically, or so on, that can transmit the feeling of the moment of participation, because that too we must find a way of accounting for in the metadata of what we think of as the social media archive. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Wow. We have some time for Q&A. If there are any questions for Dr. Parham? Can you hear me? Oh.
Okay.
Okay. Any questions?
First of all, once again, thank you for a very dense and important talk. The struggle in Ferguson, in one sense, was a struggle for power. And to archive that, one would have to archive not only the black participation and the movement participation, but the police.
Absolutely.
And the contradiction there. And so the map that you showed, to what extent does that either reveal or mask the fact that there were opposite tweets?
Absolutely.
And what does that mean for our understanding of how to archive the reality of American life?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for asking that. And in Longer Version, I talk a little bit about this, and I'm glad you're bringing it up. In that map that I was showing, let's repeat a little bit. So in the map that I was showing, the moment of appearing on the map simply means you're tweeting about the event. It's not registering what you're tweeting about. And there's an interesting sort of sleight of hand that happens in that, where it takes assumptions, where on some level, not the map maker, which is separate, but the way the news article about the map is using it, on some level, part of the sort of what it's showing is, whoa, look at how all the people in the world are tweeting about this small event. And so there's already an assumption there of smallness of the occurrence of death that makes the use of the map be about simply the fact of participation itself, so that the meaningfulness of this death is on some level registered as a quantitative reality of how many people care about it, whether they care positively or negatively, right? In a way, there's something I think actually important and interesting and maybe even not neutral, but useful and productive there to think about, in that what does it mean to take all these localized sort of moments and think about them in a social media context where, of course, they've become globalized or nationalized, of course. And you have the complexity of even thinking about action in Ferguson and the real question of like people who live in St. Louis who are participating versus people who are coming from all over the country. You know, there's a real complexity we know there. But what gets lost in that, and I feel like this is what your question is getting at, are the ways in which just because people are participating and care, it would be very dangerous for Black people to imagine that the care is for their benefit. And so this moment that gets talked about in the map and that story, sense of like, isn't it so great how social media is allowing all these people to connect with this important event? What gets lost are the ways in which even the immensity of participation doesn't have to mean anything good for Black people. And how you get that story to emerge out of it goes back to this real issue of what it means for the people in this room and just for people sort of on the street who do care about these issues to also be able to, on one hand, parlay that feeling of participation and that importance, rather, while at the same time keeping our own agenda at the forefront. Is that?
Are there any other questions? Well, could we thank Professor Parham for another, I mean, it's a brilliant presentation. Another round of applause, please.